Hello and welcome to the Whitehall Sources podcast, where we take you inside politics at Westminster. I'm Calum Macdonald. Hello. And this is Kirsty Buchanan, who was a special advisor to the Prime Minister Theresa May. Hello, Kirsty.
Good morning, Calum.
And Joe Tanner, political strategist. Hello, Joe.
Good morning, Calum and Kirsty.
Joe, have you got conference croaky voice? Is that what that is?
Is it? Gosh, I didn't know I did. Sorry. I didn't know I did. Oh,
Have we been hitting the karaoke?
No, the days of me, being the party queen, etc., have gone. I'm being super sensible these days because of my broadcasting here, there, and everywhere, and quite frankly, because I'm old, and because I'm also going on my honeymoon next week. So I'm making sure that I'm not sick for that.
I love it. You were in Liverpool for...
It's just husky for you, Calum. That's all.
Well, I mean, this works for me, Joe. Don't you worry about that. How's your week been, Kirsty? Are you well?
Well, I've been suffering from FOMO, Calum.
Oh, yeah.
Because I've not been at Liverpool and I am one of life's great political nerds. In fact, I should call it FOMOP, fear of missing out politically.
Yeah, fair.
So
although I will say...
I've been suffering from FOMOP, poor me.
My notorious inability at life admin meant that I didn't have a pass to actually get beyond the security cordon in Liverpool. So I was just mooching around various cafes, meeting various people and saying hello, which actually is quite nice.
You might have had it revoked. You might have had it revoked even if you had one. It seems to be fashionable these days.
That's true. Other people did, didn't they? Owen Jones among them. People from Novara Media seemed to have their accreditation cancelled halfway through the conference.
Yeah, there was some weird stuff going on. I mean, I always think there's a lot to be said for being there, but to be honest, Kirsty, you probably are aware of more that goes on in terms of the narrative and what is attempting to be sold when you watch it on telly and absorb it via other media than when you're actually there, because you could be there and not see a single politician give a speech from a proper lectern, and you can go to lots of fringe events, but you do the conference when you're there versus conference in terms of what is seen externally is they're two very different experiences, because at least when you're seeing the media side, you can see the curation of it all, whereas actually you only see your conference based on your interactions and what you choose to see, so you can be fully aware or very, very unaware of what's really going on when you're around. So, but I have to say, the corporate world, if we're looking at growth as a big challenge for the country, it looks as though the public affairs world, the lobbying world, is alive and well. I mean, an extensive array of sponsors backing all sorts of activity, from huge new lounges, Politico pub, fringe spaces, collaborations galore, like serious innovation
do love a good
going
collab.
on. Honestly, serious money being spent and real innovation going on. There is clearly, even though the debates ended up being about, whether Nigel Farage's policies or whether Nigel Farage is racist and all this other stuff that's going on, there is some serious business going on now. There's clearly a feeling that there is something that the debate needs, the interaction, that people need to get into it, because people were spending money on getting involved. It was really interesting.
And talking about serious business, you've got some news too, Calum, haven't you?
Yes. This is very important news, actually. So Whitehall Sources is the original Sources podcast, launched by Kirsty and myself and Oscar back in the day. And here we are, doing our thing, taking you inside politics at Westminster. Then Holyrood Sources came along to take you inside politics at Holyrood in the Scottish Parliament. Then Stormont Sources is absolutely blazing a trail, taking you inside politics in Northern Ireland as well. And now the family is finally complete this week with the launch of Senedd Sources, taking you inside politics in Wales. Ollie Cole, Joe Kiernan and Craig Lawton are your hosts on Senedd Sources, and they are brilliant. And by the way, episode 1, which drops, today at time of recording, on Wednesday the 1st of October, sets the context out for why the next few months in Wales are potentially politically dynamite. In short, because Labour may drop out of power in Wales for the first time, basically ever, to be honest, because of the surge and the rise of Reform UK. Wales is fascinating. And I think, actually, Kirsty, my take from listening to the guys recording, which you can hear in your podcast feed now, is that Wales could actually be the story of the night in May next year after the elections. Even with my Scottish bias in mind, I think the sort of wipeout of Labour in Wales could be the dominating story.
It would be absolutely seismic. Labour has held on to power in Cardiff since the then Welsh Assembly was set up. It is almost inconceivable of a world where Labour doesn't dominate Welsh politics. And, if people are sort of saying, oh, well, what was all this kind of gloves off at conference in Liverpool this week all about, the general election is 4 years away. Well, yes, it is, but we are something like 7 months away from local elections and a massive election in Scotland and in Wales. And I think you're right. If they lose in Wales, all those conversations that we'll be having today and going on about Keir Starmer's leadership will come roaring right back to the front again, because if they lose there, then that is about as seismic as it gets for Labour.
Yeah. So I urge you to subscribe to all the podcasts. The latest edition is Senedd Sources, Stormont Sources, Holyrood Sources, and of course you're here on Whitehall Sources as well. Lots to discuss today. As we
You want real patriotism, folks, you find it here.
Hang on.
That's where the real patriots are.
We ought to have a Buchanan bugle to celebrate. It should be like, well done to the Sources team.
Yeah.
Calum with the special sauce. Well done.
Thanks.
Marvellous stuff.
I'm not quite sure how we're going to...
Calum is the secret sauce to all the sauces.
That is not true. What was that you said about having a fanfare, Joe? You ask and I deliver.
Can I just point out, so obviously I do this little bit on Times Radio called Buchanan's Bugle, where I get a bugle that sounds a bit like this. Can I not have that one?
Well,
that's a fanfare, folks.
I'm happy to send it in to them. So there you are. The Sources family is complete. Listen, subscribe, find us on YouTube, find us on podcast apps. Just be part of the conversation. We love to have you there. Today on Whitehall Sources is all about debriefing the Labour Party conference, which has been described really as make or break in some ways for Sir Keir Starmer going into it. Here we are kind of emerging out the other side of it. It's clear, I think, that he has framed a fight with Reform UK. I think from his first interview with Laura Kuenssberg last Sunday, where she asked him whether Reform UK's immigration policy was racist, and he said basically yes. From then, that has been the dominating kind of foundation of this tussle with Reform UK. Kirsty, in terms of that framing, is that strategically sensible?
It's risky. Look, let's step back a minute here and remind ourselves what it looked like for Starmer going into this conference in Liverpool. He'd had a disastrous couple of weeks. He'd lost his deputy leader. He'd had to sack Peter Mandelson, the UK ambassador to the United States. Labour is tanking in the polls. Andy Burnham was on pretty naked manoeuvres for the leadership, and Starmer was ranked as the least popular Prime Minister in history. So quite a challenge to kind of galvanise the membership and galvanise the conference hall behind him. Now, he's had a very good conference. I think, that's fair to say. Burnham flamed out. And what we have seen is the one thing that we've been saying since they got elected in July last year. What is Keir Starmer about? What is the purpose of this Labour government? And hats off to the new communications team at Number 10. Starmer's quite a bloodless politician, but actually what we've seen over the last couple of days is the creation of a story, a compelling narrative that they can hang everything else on. They've managed to inject a bit of fire into Starmer's belly and into those kind of lines to take that we've heard the Cabinet kind of repeating from the conference floor. And that is quite an achievement. Where I think it is risky is twofold. One, do you really want to go toe-to-toe with Mr. Farage about who is Mr. Britain? So I think that is a potentially risky strategy. And two, this works well in the conference floor, but how quickly will the water close over this when we've got, one, that horrendous budget and the £30 billion black hole that was ever present but nowhere mentioned over the last few days in Liverpool. And two, obviously, these looming elections coming where Labour is unless it can turn things around in the next 6 to 7 months, is in for a real spanking at the ballot box.
Yeah. Joe, what's your take on the strategy? Because it has been framed now by Labour as Labour versus Reform UK. You can choose division with Nigel Farage, or you can choose something resembling patriotism and a sense of unity and purpose under Starmer. Do you agree that it's a risk?
Yeah, I think it's a huge risk. I think the first point is Keir Starmer's been Prime Minister for just over a year. Now, I don't know about anybody else, but I'd like to hear what you're going to do for me and what you're going to do for my family. And that is a huge opportunity in using that conference platform, as, to be quite honest, are many of the other platforms that you get as Prime Minister, to make a speech and to talk about the things that you are going to do. And this government has failed to articulate what it is doing for anybody, really. The thing that's heralded repeatedly are breakfast clubs as something that they've managed to deliver, and one in, one out, and a series of homes apparently being built, but the Secretary of State, like, responsible for them, can't tell you how many when asked on an interview. And what's interesting is, I think there is something to be said, Kirsty, the comms team, on the one hand, yes, well done, there is a form of narrative has been developed, but actually the end of last week was a complete, dog's breakfast, really, with the whole sort of the place stuff on one day, which looked like a big announcement that they were getting behind. They then shot themselves with their second one the next day on ID cards. That then sort of disrupted everything in the run into conference. Then everyone was spending, from a comms perspective, everyone was spending the approach to conference saying, what exactly is this mantra about patriotic renewal? What does it mean? What does it mean? And it sort of took until the speech yesterday to really understand where Starmer was coming from in terms of what it is that he's sort of setting out. But I still don't understand why I do know there are elections coming, but we're setting out a battleground for the whole country when we still haven't really understood what the delivery is going to be on the things that were voted for at the general election, when there was apparently a plan for change that people voted for. And so it feels like Starmer's kind of going back to almost electioneering type speeches, as opposed to prime ministerial speaking, in terms of what I'm going to do for you. And the problem, I think, where Kirsty's right about the danger, is it's not just that he's going up with Farage about who is Mr. Britain. He's basically going up against the many, many voters that he actually needs to win back if he's got any hope of winning an election later on this next year or at a future general election.
Yeah.
And so the problem is we're sort of in electioneering mode, when the best way to win an election is to demonstrate that you've delivered a load of stuff, which means people will go, yeah, I'm buying into that project, and I'll carry on.
Do you agree, Kirsty?
Yeah, look, I mean, I think that's problematic at this particular moment in time because, what you hear from Starmer is, to some certain extent, a perfectly fair plea for patience because, economic renewal isn't something that happens overnight. And he has consistently said, I will be judged at the next general election on three things. One, whether people feel better off than they did before they elected us. Two, whether public services are beginning to turn around and most notably the NHS. And three, whether people feel safe and secure in their own communities and sort of secure in the country at large. And I think it's fair enough to repeat the kind of, the essence that is going to take some time. I think where I have an issue with the message as it was is the more I listened to it, the more I kind of was struck by the unbelievable chutzpah that sat at the heart of it, right? This claim that I am Mr. Patriot and we are the patriotic party. No party over the last 30 years has done more to denigrate working class Britons who have a legitimate concern about the scale of migration in this country than the Labour Party. No party has done that. So to turn around now and in terms again say, right, there is a version of patriotism that we find acceptable and a version that we don't find acceptable, and then present that as a kind of positive case, when actually it feels to me relatively kind of a new gloss on a relatively divisive point. And the thing that really struck me about it was the kind of repudiation of everything everything that I would say that Starmer stands for and everything that Farage says that Starmer stands for, which is precisely why Farage has got this kind of populist groundswell behind him. You know, this repudiation of globalisation from a man who worked tooth and nail to prevent Brexit from happening and wanted a second referendum against the wishes of the British people, who turned round and told the British people that Corbyn would be a good Prime Minister for this country, you know, and who said he was more comfortable in Davos than he was in Westminster. This is a man who's now trying to wrap himself in the flag and say to us, you know, I am the authentic face of patriotic Britain. Is that going to fly with the public? I'm not sure.
What do we think of the sort of nature of the fight then on those terms? Here's what the Prime Minister, Sir Keir Starmer, told Christopher Hope of GB News. He said, and listen out for the Farage boat in all of this. Here's the quote. I would gently point out to Nigel Farage and others that before we left the EU, we had a returns agreement with every country in the EU, and he told the country it will make no difference if we left. Well, he was wrong about that. These are Farage boats in many senses that are coming across the channel. Joe, I can't help but think it's almost reminiscent of how Donald Trump brands people and brands policies. Sleepy Joe is a good one to think of as how he described Joe Biden. This idea of kind of taking something that is a deeply politically charged issue and tying it to a person, in this case, Nigel Farage.
Yeah, I mean, it's got deeply personal, and I think it's been made worse with, you know, the comments that came from David Lammy when, you know, he got into this Hitler Youth comment that he made to the BBC that he then had to row back from.
So this was him saying that Farage had flirted with Hitler Youth, and in the end,
which had actually ended before Farage had even been born. But you know, Diane Abbott was on Newsnight last night talking about how it was something. She made some comment about how it could be right to give people a kicking or something. There was some.
That's right.
There's sort of just the nature of the. I mean, it's sort of reminiscent of some of the Brexit conversations that went on, and how. I mean, I remember being on Politics Live when Will Self made the comment about how the majority of racists and bigots had voted for Brexit, and then Mark Francois was on there and sort of went, so you're saying that everyone that voted for Brexit's a racist and a bigot? And Will Self was saying, no. I'm saying that most racists and bigots voted for Brexit. And it was this sort of tried to make a distinction, but essentially we are sort of seeing a kind of divide, which is going, it feels like there is a divide that is being drawn that is very similar to those lines that we played out during Brexit, which I'm kind of a bit sad about, that everyone wants to relive it because it was so miserable the first time round and it pitted people against each other. And I'm already seeing comments online from people that I know and respect and like, who are, you know, friends. I'm not talking political people. I'm not talking commentators. I'm talking about people on Facebook, other mothers, other dads who are putting up comments that are quite inflammatory because they feel quite angry about the way that they feel they're being labelled by their Prime Minister because of their support for the position that reform is taking. And that's where this is a hell of a tightrope to be walking. When you want to brand an individual, but that individual is a leader for a lot of other people's thoughts and is the person that they identify with, they feel that they are being branded as a result of their support for that person. And this just feels like an incredibly difficult tightrope to walk. And I would say that the bigger question is, was this the strategy? Or did the strategy get derailed in response to the BBC's Laura Kuenssberg, who asked a very direct question and brought up the word racist? Now, had she not done that, would this whole debate have gone quite the way it's gone this week? I'm not sure. But it feels like there was a leaning in after that interview took place. And that's changed things significantly, I think.
And if you are not at conference and you're not, you know, a kind of political geek, and you don't sit and listen to endless debates and endless angel on a pin, you know, dancing on the head of a pin type arguments about, you know, I'm not calling Nigel Farage a racist, I'm saying his policies are racist, you know, I'm playing the ball and not the man. If you're a normie just going about your business, right, and bits of the conference infiltrate in, the only takeaway you've probably got from this conference is that Starmer has called Nigel Farage a racist.
Mm.
And
Agreed.
by implication, the 30% of people, presumably, that support Farage and think, finally, here is a person who's listening to us, by implication, you're painting them into that same kind of corner too. If I said to you, Joe, I think that statement you just made was racist, you would take offence, right?
Mm-hmm.
Because it's the same, I'm being cutesy about it, but I'm basically saying, I think that what you've said is beyond the pale and therefore you're beyond the pale. And so actually you're saying that to a whole group of people. And at the same time, you are trying to recognise the very thing that you are trying to condemn. So at the same time as he's saying this version of cracking down on indefinite leave to remain as put out by Nigel Farage is a racist policy, we have Shabana Mahmood, the Home Secretary, cracking down on indefinite leave to remain in a very similar way. We've got two parties basically trying to move the goalposts of a game that's kind of mid-flow, right?
Yeah.
Again, to normies, trying to explain that one is fair and respectful and decent and one is evil and wicked and racist, it's a nonsense.
Yeah.
You're both trying to crack down on it because the scale of indefinite leave to remain after the Boris wave is a potential huge problem. At the same time, you've got a prime minister recognising that small boats and illegal migration to this country is a huge problem and is trying to tackle it. So on the one hand, you recognise all the things that surged reform in its popularity in the first place, and on the same time, you're trying to paint them as being wicked and evil for stepping into that and recognising it before you did. It's a madness.
I would have taken a totally different strategy, and I'm sure I'll get laughed out the room for this, but if I'd been Keir Starmer, I would have said, it's very clear that Nigel Farage is tapping into concerns that people have. They are concerns that people who support all different political parties had. They are concerns that I have as Prime Minister about the levels of people that arrive on small boats. I am concerned about the fact that we're not processing, asylum claims quickly enough. I'm concerned about those challenges. We are working hard to deal with it. This is why we negotiated this deal. This is why we're negotiating that deal. But I will not tolerate the kind of language and the kind of fear that indefinite leave to remain policy could lead to, or has even led to for some people. So I will invite Nigel Farage in and his team and Zia or whoever, and we will sit down and we will work out a way to have this debate in a sensible, grown-up way that does not genuine concerns for people that have no reason to be concerned, but that also helps stabilise our NHS workers, some of those words would have applied to, or something of that ilk. I would have tried to do something that said, almost like, come in from the cold on this, because you just talking about this outside is dangerous and is risky and it's not right. And I'd have almost tried to bring him closer, because then anything that would have been done would have almost had Nigel's seal of approval on it or his fingerprints on it. And then if it didn't work, he could have blamed Nigel for it not. Nigel would have been part of the collective blame. But this pitting against, I think, is really risky.
And it's a fascinating point, actually. It's a sort of, in terms, Joe, you're advocating to the nation, we hear you, we understand, we get it. That's why we're trying to act. We will strain every sinew. And I wonder whether, listening to you talk, whether that's because you're a woman. And again, what we've seen at number 10, I mean, I like a fight, from a political observer point of view. But what we've seen is two new comms directors come in that are both men of a certain age, who've clearly said, right, you've got to take the fight to, you've just got to take this head on. There's no getting around this. You've got to take on, and go toe to toe with Farage. And actually what you've got is a very kind of male, muscular version of a political debate. So actually, I don't think that's laughable at all. I think
But you've also got a Prime Minister that talks about the coalition of the willing, on the other hand, when you've got a big seismic problem. So you kind of go, surely his instincts are there. And maybe you're right. Maybe it is a comms thing, because we're seeing Steph Driver going out in the other direction. So maybe there is something in that. But it does come back down to the realisation that you're not just taking on Nigel Farage. You're talking about
his supporters.
At least a third of the population and more. The silent reformers, the ones who maybe don't feel they can declare or haven't been asked about voting for reform, but actually are deeply uncomfortable. They are people that are a bit nervous about what's going on in their areas. There are people that are starting to look at other people with suspicion and fear. And they're not bad people. They're not racist. The people they're looking at are probably not bad people. But this sense is growing. And I just feel like blowing the argument up and having a bigger row, I can't see how this ends well for anybody. It doesn't make good policy. We saw this in some of the stuff that went on in the gender debate. When everyone just gets angrier and angrier, you get more of these off-the-cuff comments, you get more damaging rhetoric, and you don't actually solve any problems.
Well, should we at this point then mention Zia Yusuf of Reform UK, who was speaking to Times Radio this morning? He told Times Radio that the parliamentary authorities have cut Nigel Farage's security detail by 75%. He said he was thinking long and hard about whether to share that because it's so sensitive, but he felt it was necessary given the stakes, he said. He said 2 weeks ago they did this, and then he pointed to the extraordinary 48 hours of demonisation by senior Labour Party figures of Nigel Farage. He said donors have stepped in, thankfully, to shore up the security and make sure that Nigel is well protected. But if anything was to happen to Nigel, we will hold Keir Starmer squarely responsible. Zia Yusuf said, when was the last time you heard the Prime Minister, 11 Cabinet Ministers, the Deputy Prime Minister, and any number of other people, he mentions Diane Abbott as well, all in the space of 48 hours saying these sorts of things? He pointed to the Diane Abbott quote, all for giving Nigel Farage a good kicking. What do you make of the intensification of this conversation, which seems to be that Reform UK are now really pinning any security jeopardy for Farage on the Prime Minister? It's worth noting that in his interview with Kate McCann on Times Radio, Sir Keir Starmer said, I'm not ramping up the any calls for aggression or whatever against Farage. That's not what I'm about here in this language. But that's the response of Reform UK.
Yeah, and how's that for a clapback?
Yeah.
Within 24 hours. And I listened to the Times Radio interview, and Kate McCann, who led that interview, made some very good points about, Starmer's language.
Yeah. And
she said, look, you're talking about an enemy. You're talking about someone who wants to tear the country apart. You're talking about taking the fight and this being the fight for the soul of the country. This is very aggressive language. And I think, two things have really kind of shaken up people in the kind of political world over the last, whether you're on this side of the Atlantic or the other. One, I think, that shook up everybody, including probably people in Reform, was the scale of the Tommy Robinson Unite the Kingdom or whatever it was called march.
Yeah, that's right.
Just how large that was. Farage's argument has always been, if you don't listen to the frustrations of people now and act accordingly, you want to see what comes after me. What comes after me is what Shabana Mahmood was talking about in her conference speech to the Home Secretary. This rise of this very alarming, very disturbing ethno-nationalism within the country, and a rise of anti-Muslim hatred within the country, and a spreading of kind of neo-Nazi conspiracy theories about, great replacement theory. All of that is happening. It's true. Let's not overblow it, but it is a definite strain. It doesn't belong to Reform. It sits outside of Reform. And I think Shabana Mahmood made a distinction arguably better than anybody else has made. The other was the shooting of Charlie Clark. And I think that has really...
Kirk, yeah.
Sorry, Charlie Kirk. I think that has really shaken up both the Republican Party and the Conservative Party and the Reform Party in this country, the centre-right, because it is, the more you up language and rhetoric, the more you fuel a sense that people are justified, people, who are wrapped up, have mental health problems quite often, they feel emboldened and justified to take real action to silence people whose views they don't agree with. That is why it is dangerous. And I think, yes, there's been a deliberate upping of the rhetoric, but you know how Farage works and you know the playbook. So you must, I would have hoped, anticipated that the clapback was going to come back strong and hard, and thus it is proved.
Joe?
I mean, again, I just find the whole thing deeply worrying. Like, I think I think the reform team are getting better and better at not only grabbing the agenda proactively, but also responding to events as they happen. I think they are getting much quicker. They're getting much more, just much more professional, I suppose, in terms of how they are organising themselves. The Zia Usis stuff, I think, is hugely worrying. I mean, we've all lived through some absolutely terrible things to have happened around our parliament, to have happened to individual MPs. And, that's aside from individual threats that even, I've had stuff even as a 2-bit commentator. I've had stuff that's been sent to me online that is really unpleasant and pretty threatening. And I can't imagine how people in the public eye feel about this stuff. And so when the sort of the rhetoric and when the debate is being pushed so strongly by the politicians themselves, when we have spent so much time talking about protection for our politicians and being able to talk about issues while not being afraid of speaking out, it puts enormous strain on the security services. It puts enormous strain on their teams. It puts enormous strain on just those staffers that work for those individuals. But it also just makes me worry about the direction of our debate, because it is so much easier for individuals to express themselves. It's so much easier for individuals to make very direct threats against those in public life. And if we stand for anything, we should be about encouraging people to step up and get involved in those discussions. But when you start to be afraid about expressing yourself potentially because of what might happen, and while Farage, is fine, good, he's got security and he's got donors that can pay for whatever that extra security is that he needs, there are plenty of other people that are involved in these discussions that don't.
The thing with the strength of Reform's pushback on this is quite clever. I mean, I'm not arguing it's not heartfelt. I think it actually is heartfelt. I really genuinely think that the right, both in the United States and the United Kingdom, have been really shaken by that assassination. So I do think it's heartfelt. But it also has the effect of trying to silence what is potentially a problematic narrative for Reform. And so actually, in the space of 24 hours, you've gone from, the pressure being on Reform and Farage to sort of say, your policies are divisive and they're racist policies and they're sowing division in the country, to all the media saying to Labour politicians, you are stoking this debate, you have raised the rhetoric, you have put people at risk, that is irresponsible of a government. So actually you flip round the kind of framing of the debate, and if you're going to, Farage is the master of communication, and you have a whole kind of Trump playbook here. You've already, ironically, had the Prime Minister say in his speech, look, they nurse the politics of grievance and they nurse the politics of victim. And then what do? You make him a victim by singling him out and calling him a racist and saying, things like, he flirted with the Hitler Youth in his youth. Well, what did you think Farage was going to do with that, except come back hard on it and accuse you of poisoning political debate in a way that doesn't befit, a prime minister, at the same time as he's trying to promote in the hall a message of kind of hope and unity and renewal, brackets, but only for people that, that think like we do. So I think it was, clever of Reform to turn that around as quickly as they did. But I also genuinely think it is heartfelt. I think there is a outside of politics, there is a growing toxicity in our public debate, and I think actually, I think there's a perfectly legitimate argument to say I expect my Prime Minister to act against that, not to fuel it.
Yeah. So then, I suppose, just by way of conclusion with you both, was this the conference that Starmer needed? Has it been what he needed it to be, given the context that Kirsty set out right at the start of the podcast that he was going into this with? And Jen, the conversation was around, will he emerge and survive this conference? Well, the next flashpoint is the budget, which I think arguably will be a bigger deal than conference in terms of political implications, public implications, electoral implications, all of that. And then there are elections in May next year, Scotland, Wales, and local council as well. Joe, was this the conference that Starmer needed it to be?
Yeah, it's an interesting question, because I think on the one hand, as the leader of the party, going into the problems that we talked about him having with do you remember there's a deputy leadership contest going on that we thought was going to dominate the discussion? Well, that didn't happen.
That's gone away.
You know, Andy Burnham, who sort of started off, as you mentioned, and then sort of, was like a firework that went out fairly quickly, and was even seen leaving before Keir Starmer delivered his speech. So on the one hand, the sort of questions about the man and who is he and has he got what it takes, he would probably, and his team would probably think, yes, he managed to hold the agenda. He managed to we're talking about what Starmer said. In the midst of all this, we had the Trump stuff, the Trump and the Gaza deal being announced. Yeah. There was a lot of other stuff going on that then for the Labour Party and for Keir himself to actually have some presence in that was a pretty big deal. So on the one hand, I'd say, yes, this was pretty significant for him. But I almost feel like he's leaving with a monumental hangover, which is a sort of, now he's got this baggage of this slight sort of explosion that's kind of gone on now that is going to sort of ripple off in lots of different directions. And this backlash that is now sort of growing in terms of what Reform are saying, the climb down that Lammy had to make. We're pretty much going to have every Labour politician asked a difficult question about, is Nigel Farage racist? Do you agree with this point, that point? We're going to see this kind of, do you think that Nigel Farage's security should be reviewed? And is that even a decision the government were involved in, or is this just a Lindsay Hoyle Speaker and House Authorities decision? There's a lot of different things that are now going to be at play, which I think the bit that people are going to remember from Starmer's speech is probably going to be very little. I think the commentators and Labour folks will say, didn't he do well? He had some gumption. And I think there's no question it was the most passionate and sort of energised we've probably seen Keir Starmer. So from that point of view, you chalk that as a win. But actually, I think the destruction and the potential disarray that this is now going to cause, I think is going to be problematic, because I think it's going to cause a lot of veering off of course and conversations about other stuff that I'm not convinced they will have actually wanted.
Kirsty, same question. Is this the conference he needed?
Conferences have two audiences, the membership, the PLP, party membership, the unions in this case, and to the country at large. Starmer needed a win with the membership. There's a lot of muttering about whether he's the right man for the job that goes right up to cabinet and right across the kind of conference floor. From that point of view, I think it was a good conference for Starmer. I think he displayed some gumption, some fire in his belly, prepared to take the fight to Reform. All of that plays very well. And Andy Burnham shooting himself in the foot obviously kind of stopped that being a kind of core narrative of the conference. So from a party management point of view, for now, it was a good job, well done and well delivered.
And they will have made some decent money, by the way, from a party management point of view.
For the country at large,
yeah.
For the country at large, he's trying to galvanise people to his version of patriotism. I think it's a high-risk strategy. I think we both agreed on that, me and Joe.
Yeah.
I think we'll wait and see which voters it galvanises and to who. And ultimately, this was never going to be a game changer for him, because we've got a horrendous budget coming down the line, an absolutely horrendous budget, which will tsunami any gains he might have made from this. And then we've got those elections. So ironically, it is not beyond the realms of possibility that this might have been his best speech as Labour leader to conference, and it still might be his last.
And I would say that the only other question that we have not addressed is what was going on with the cabinet yesterday while he was speaking. Because if you watch the footage, the cutaways to the cabinet looked like they'd all had some terrible news or were not behind what was going to be coming. There was something really odd. They looked tense. Rachel Reeves looked incredibly upset again. There was an awkward moment where she was sort of looking round to see whether there was an ovation coming for part of the speech, and she looked incredibly tense. And just as you pan to different faces, the usual, it was sort of weird that they had their flags, but they almost looked like they'd been sort of thrust into their hands, and they were sort of almost, it reminded me of the sort of the employees that are at those speeches like hostages behind when the PM delivers a speech, it looked like the cabinet, body language wise, it looked like they didn't really want to be there because they weren't particularly keen on what was coming or something else was going on. But it was the big question that I had, and I saw a lot of comments online that said the same.
Thanks, Joe. Thanks, Kirsty. We will see what happens from here on out, because it has been quite an intense few days of party conference. I suppose in theory we maybe should have talked about the Conservative Party conference, which happens next week. Fear not, we will cover whatever emerges from that.
If anything emerges
Isn't
from
the
that.
psychology of that so interesting? We have just done a whole podcast on Labour Party conference, and this is the first mention of the Conservatives. That's astonishing, actually. That's not deliberate, by the way. That's just something I've clocked now, Kirsty.
Yeah, look, I mean, this is the challenge for the Conservatives, the battle for relevance.
Yeah.
As, you know, two tribes go to war and they sort of been relegated to third and, if they're not careful, fourth place in the minds and the hearts of the British public. I think there's every chance that they'll probably open by trying to do something, you know, to grab the headlines, announcing that they will withdraw from the European Convention of Human Rights would be my guess of thing most likely to open it up. But their battle is to try and navigate a path in between these kind of two guys now going, you know, toe to toe between now and the elections next May. I think there is arguably a place for them in a sort of, you know, we are sensible. We have sensible solutions. We have decent solutions. You can try and navigate in that space, but it's very difficult for Kemi Badenoch to get any relevance against a government that just holds a narrative and holds a lot of the top of the media because it's the government.
Yeah.
And B, against Farage, who's probably the most adept political campaigner since Boris Johnson.
And isn't the first question going to be, do you agree with the Prime Minister or do you agree with Mr Farage around, you know, this issue? Do you agree that he's a racist, or do you agree his policies are racist? Like, you're going to go in that direction pretty quickly, and she's got to decide whether to almost back reform voters and say people are right to have concerns, but we need to work harder to address them, or she's almost going to have to say Nigel Farage's approach is wrong, and therefore potentially pit herself against a lot of the people that are supporting his view. She's on a, to use your metaphor earlier about dancing on the pin, I think it's like that little pointy bit of the needle, let alone a pin. There's not even a pinhead to get on there. It's such a dicey position to be in.
Yeah. Right, there we are. Well, there's the mention of the Conservatives, the token mention of the Conservative Party in 2025. We'll consider their conference next week, whatever emerges from it. Kirsty and Joe, thank you both very much indeed. Thank you for listening to the Whitehall Sources podcast, one of a family of 4 now. You can also get Holyrood Sources, Stormont Sources and Senedd Sources, covering politics from across the UK. And of course, you can WhatsApp us with all of your thoughts. We love to hear from you. If you've got questions particularly for Kirsty and Joe, then pop us a message. The number is 0333 404 6507 and start your message with the word Whitehall, or you can email hello@whitehallsources.com. We look forward to getting your messages, we look forward to hearing from you, and we look forward to speaking to you again next week.